If you create graphics for the web in Illustrator, you can bring those graphics into a composition that you're creating in Photoshop. In another movie in this chapter, I showed you how to do that by exporting out of Illustrator in Photoshop document format, .psd format. Another way to bring Illustrator objects into Photoshop is as vector smart objects. This is an efficient way to work between the two applications because it gives you the opportunity to quickly go back into Illustrator, make changes to the file there, and have it automatically update in Photoshop. To show you how this works, I have two documents open, one in Photoshop CS4 here, and one in Illustrator CS4. The PSD file is a composition that I'm building in Photoshop. This AI file contains some vector artwork, these sandals, that I made in Illustrator. You can see that I'm now working in Illustrator. I'd like to bring the Illustrator artwork into the Photoshop document to add it to my composition there. I'll select the black arrow tool, which is the selection tool, and then I'll come into the Illustrator file and I'll click and drag to select the sandals. Then I'm going to go up to the Edit menu in Illustrator and I'm going to choose Copy. Now I can close this Illustrator file, I'm done with it, and click back on the Photoshop file, which takes me back into Photoshop CS4. Here I'm going to go to the Edit menu and I'm going to choose Paste. I have a choice of how I want to paste this object, as pixels, a path, a shape layer, or a smart object. With Smart Object selected, I'm going to click OK, and that brings the sandals into the Photoshop file surrounded by this bounding box. In just a moment, I'm going to convert these objects from their current vector-based format, which is composed of drawing instructions, to a pixel-based format, which is composed of pixels of color information. But before I do that, I have the opportunity to resize them without harming the image at all because they're still vector-based. So I'm going to move over one of the corners of this bounding box. I'm going to hold down the Shift key to constrain proportions, and then I'll click on one corner and drag toward the center of the sandals to make them smaller. Then I'll release the mouse and I'll click inside the bounding box and drag to position the sandals where I want them. And finally, I'll go up to the Options bar and I'll click the check mark there. Over in the Layers panel, I see that the illustration came in on a new separate layer labeled Vector Smart Object. And notice that the thumbnail has a special symbol that identifies the layer as a Smart Object layer. A Vector Smart Object brought in from Illustrator remains linked to the Illustrator file from which it originated. And that means that I can make changes to the object in the Illustrator file, and those changes will be automatically updated in this Photoshop file. To do that, I'm going to double-click the thumbnail on the Vector Smart Object layer. I'll click OK at the prompt, and that relaunches Illustrator CS4 and opens the Illustrator file that contains the sandals. That relaunches Illustrator and opens this file which contains the Vector Smart Object. For example, I might want to change the shape of the sandal on the left so that it matches the round toe of the sandal on the right. To do that, I'm going to go up to the toolbox and I'm going to click on the white arrow tool, the direct selection tool, and then I'll come back into the image and I'll click on the edge of the left sandal. That brings up these Bezier handles. If I click on one of those handles and drag, I can change the shape of the toe of that sandal. To change the color of this selected sandal, I'll go up to the Color panel, and I'll drag the sliders there to fill the left sandal with a different color. To apply the same color to the right sandal, I'll click on the edge of the right sandal, and then I'll go over to the toolbox, and I'll click on the Fill Color box there. And then I'll click on the artboard to deselect. Now I'm going to save this Illustrator file with these changes by going up to the File menu and choosing Save. It's important to save the changed file over the original, so I don't want to choose Save As, and I don't want to save elsewhere or with a different name. I'll just choose File, Save. I'm going to close the Illustrator file again, and I'll go back and click on the Photoshop composition in Photoshop CS4. And notice that the sandals have changed color, and the left sandal is now more rounded than it was. So the changes that I made in Illustrator automatically updated the Vector Smart Object here in Photoshop. So that's the advantage of working with a Vector Smart Object when you bring content from Illustrator CS4 into Photoshop CS4.